Thank you for being here this afternoon for our Proofs Cast the Shadow panel. I'm going to leave a lot of the explanation for what this is to Keith and Misha, but I do want to point your attention to some reading series events that are coming next week. We have David Lynn's book launch, 4:30 Tuesday, in the Pierce Lounge, and his books will be there for sale. Wednesday next week, Stuart Onan is coming. This is in collaboration with Gramercy Books. That will be 4:30 here. And then if you take a look at the website, you'll note that Chen Chen is coming the next Wednesday, and Tommy Pico is coming the next Thursday. So we are packed with activities and opportunities for you to have some literary engagement. But now I will hand it over to Keith to get this thing started.
Thank you. I wanted to thank Elizabeth for helping put this together, for the KR Associates for making this event possible. Thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day out, so thank you for making time for this poetry discussion. There'll be a little bit of poetry as well towards the end. And I want to thank all of our out-of-town panelists for coming in. For at least one of them is a very long flight, and so we also appreciate that. And we will begin this panel by introducing the panelists and the project to all of you, and then discussion will follow, and after which Grace will have a short reading from her new collection, Kareen, and then we'll sort of open it up for discussion with all of you. So yeah, Misha Rai, who is also a part of this project, she'll also be introduced in a moment. She will introduce our first panelist.
Yeah. So Gabrielle Bellot is a staff writer for Literary Hub. She grew up in the Commonwealth of Dominica. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Guardian, Shondaland, Guernica, Slate, Tin House, the Paris Review Daily, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Cut, Vice, Electric Literature. She's so hot. And many other places. She is the recipient of the 2016 Poynter Fellowship from Yale and also holds a legacy fellowship from Florida State University. Bellot holds both an MFA and a PhD in fiction from Florida State University and currently teaches classes at Catapult and Gotham Writers Workshop. Her writing tends to focus on global literature, LGBTQIA identities, literary history, exile, the Caribbean broadly, and what it might mean, at least for the day you ask her, to navigate the world as a multiracial transgender woman of color. She's working on her first novel and she lives in Brooklyn, New York.
Grace Shui Liu is the author of Kareen from Noemi Press. This is it. She grew up in her work has appeared in West Branch, Black Warrior Review, Kenyon Review, Cream City Review, and elsewhere. She is a Watering Hole Fellow, and her other honors include the Lucille Clifton Poetry Fellowship from Squaw Valley Community of Writers, Aspen Summer Word Scholarship, resident writer at Conserrat in Barcelona, resident at Agora Effect, and others. She holds a BA in philosophy and an MFA in creative writing. She's the contributing editor for Waxwing. Born and raised in Malaysia, a former colony of the British Empire, Grace thinks closely of migration, loss, sexuality, violence, and nation states. The mother figure, the mother tongue, and the motherland converge in her works alongside theories about split consciousness and their effect. Currently, she lives in New York, where she runs a burgeoning QPOC Arts Collective and works on a novel. And then Misha Rai is the 2018-2020 Kenyon Review Fellow in Prose at Kenyon College, where she is at work on her novel in progress and a collection of essays. Her prose has received multiple awards, including a MacDowell Colony Fellowship in 2018, the Dana Award in the novel category in 2017 for her novel in progress, and the Woodrow Wilson Dissertation Fellowship in Women's Studies 2016, and has appeared or is forthcoming in Tiny Crimes, Very Short Tales of Mystery and Murder, Ninth Letter, Mississippi Review, Indiana Review, Hayden's Ferry Review, Sonora Review, the Missouri Review Blog, and Crab Orchard Review. Her writing often focuses on transnational stories, historical and political fiction, history, literary suspense, exile, whether self-imposed or through banishment, and grapples with the unsettling realities of displacement and that tricky thing called memory. Misha was born in Soniput?
Yep.
Haryana, and brought up in India.
Ne Sai Serino. is the daughter of Lao refugees who immigrated to Montreal in the 1970s. She has received fellowships from One Story Kundiman and the San Francisco Writers Grotto. She is a Tin House Summer Workshop alumna, Mendocino Coast Writers Conference scholar, and reads for Bank magazine. Her writing can be found in the Funambulist, The Margins, and is forthcoming in the Kenyon Review Online. She's currently working on her first novel. Keith S. Wilson, that dude down there, is the 2018-2019 Kenyon Review Fellow in Poetry at Kenyon College. He is an Afro-Latin poet, Kaveh Khanum Fellow, game designer, and graduate of the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop. He holds an MFA in Poetry from Chicago State University. He has received 3 scholarships from Red Loaf, as well as scholarships from McDowell, UCross, Millet Colony, and the Vermont Studio Center. Keith serves as the assistant poetry editor at Four-Way Review and digital media editor at Obsidian Journal. His work has appeared or is appearing in Poetry, Adria Journal, Crab Orchard Review, Narrative, 32 Poems, Blue Ship Journal, and Vinyl. He's the author of Generation Oz, and his second book, Field Notes on Ordinary Love, which is brilliant, is forthcoming from Copper Canyon Press, although I have a copy already.
Right here.
Okay, so before we start, just a little bit about how this panel sort of came about. It's a continuation of a project that Misha Rai and I have put together called Proof Cast the Shadow. So that's right now already happening on Kenyon Review. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit, but we wanted to sort of open up with the introduction essay from Proof Cast the Shadow. So I'm going to read a portion of it. Misha will read another portion of it as well. So in October of last year, a new Associate Justice was sworn into the Supreme Court of the United States despite credible allegations of sexual misconduct against him and the promise he made, given those allegations, that what goes around comes around. Across the globe, in India as well as here in America, the related Me Too movement has affected change, and yet enforcing the law continues to be an arduous and sometimes futile process, one that results in destructive victim blaming even when justice is served. Encouraged by the biased political agenda of the current government in India, Muslim men have been lynched on suspicion of eating beef, for supposedly kidnapping children, one man's body dragged in the presence of 3 policemen, one of whom is casually checking his mobile phone, and sometimes for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The list of injustices in the last 2 years against marginalized people could itself fill this essay, even were it to only focus on America. A truncated list of American injustice: the Muslim ban, executive order 13769, the lack of support of Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria, the ongoing Flint water crisis, the trans ban on American troops, the reinvigoration of ICE, the declaration of a state of national emergency to circumvent a divided Congress in order to build a border wall. Meanwhile, at the time of writing this essay in South Asia, there's a chance that India and Pakistan, countries with nuclear weapons, might go to war over concerns of terrorism and the fact that the current Prime Minister of India is using war hysteria as a vote-mongering machine.
What you have heard is only a small sample of the brazen misdeeds perpetuated by the actions and policies not just in the 2 countries we, the Kenyon Review Fellows, represent, but which thrive across the globe. So we asked the same question previous KR Fellows, Jacqueline Diaz and Marjorie Little, proposed when they created and curated the KR Online special feature, Resistance Chain Survival. What writing is meaningful now, both to read and write? How do we as artists engage with a world that threatens so many of the bodies of its least protected? The simple answer is that we continue doing what we have always done. We write, we make art. But we believe one cannot write honestly about the world, whatever the form, without first acknowledging the condition of that world. So as we cast about for answers, acknowledging that others have asked these questions before us, we turn to literature. We have complained and discussed and read copiously, and in Rita Dove's book, American Smooth, we found the beginning of an answer. The title of our project is taken from the first line of the first section of the poem, 12 Chairs. The 13 brief poems were inspired by words carved on the backs of 12 marble chairs in the lobby of the federal courthouse in Sacramento, California, which in turn were part of an installation by the designer Larry Kirkland. In the September-October 2004 issue of Poets and Writers, Rita Dove explained that the poems were to serve as a fulcrum, because the collection is all about our particular American brand of justice. Though we intend to engage in a conversation that actively includes the world outside of America, we are reminded of the multiple readings of America's brand and of one of the roles an artist may take as an attestant whose writings are an act of witness, resistance, change, and survival.
Proof casts a shadow, a conversation, aware that the peoples of the world are irrevocably linked, will respond to policies that threaten the body and minds of populations of America and other nations. We have sought to provide a space wherein personal experience, art, and evidentiary documentation can come together to resist despair.
I think we'll open it up now to ask questions from the panelists. And one of the things that I wanted to ask is having heard this introduction and we've talked with you at length about what the project is about, I wanted to ask you, how do you see your work? If you could talk about the essays you submitted and how do you see it fit with our idea of proof casts a shadow? Maybe Gabby, you could get us started.
Sure. Thank you for being here on a lovely day. Hopefully this will not detract from the niceness of the day outside. My project for this collection of essays and poems is partly about navigating the world as a trans person. The particular ways that you learn that the world sees you and that you see the world when you walk in the shoes of a gender that is not always accepted or recognized. Earlier today, I talked about a debate that James Baldwin was moderating with Malcolm X and a student who was doing a sit-in protest. And in that debate, Malcolm X said that if you are a citizen, you don't need to fight for your civil rights. The fact that you are fighting, the fact that you are protesting, means that this country does not see you as a citizen. So my work is partly to investigate what it means to live somewhere. At what point do you become a part of the world that you walk in? And hopefully we will talk more about what all of this means. I guess that's sort of how we would start off. Yeah.
So I wrote about the deportation right now that's happening to Southeast Asian refugees, especially the ones who came here as very young children. They were usually 1 or 2, they were babies. And those who have a criminal convictions are currently being deported back. We're talking about Vietnamese refugees, Cambodian, Laotian refugees, although Laos actually has blocked those deportations, and I'm not sure about Vietnam, but definitely Cambodian deportation. I like to focus on the word proof and evidence. We're talking about criminal convictions. This idea that there is evidence of, being a bad refugee, a bad immigrant, but until then we didn't really exist, and we are being deported basically based on this notion of being imperfect, of being without protection, of basically being shadowless until the moment we commit a mistake. And I think I was attracted to it because it is such a tangible way that law interferes with the body. And we're talking about bodies, and the existence of a body can be easily denied, and it can be easily affected. And the body does not exist in a vacuum. The body exists within a community. The community itself is a body. And so I was attracted, and I wanted my project to reflect that in terms of what evidence, what proof means, what is enough to be evidence, what kind of evidence can only ever be accepted to be good versus bad evidence. And My thoughts are getting confused. But yeah, that's. I think that's why I was attracted to the project, and that's where I wanted to talk about.
That makes sense, because I think documentation is one form of narrative, and that's specifically documentation from the state, right? To say that, or even to have check boxes and say what constitutes valid reasons for you to seek asylum, and then those are very fixed markers, I think, and I think that I don't have the essay in front of me, but I think one of the points that were made had to do with what we think is America's brand of justice, and what does that mean right now. And some of the notes I took when I was reading that was to say that we can't think about America without directly thinking, or I can't think about it without directly thinking of America's brand as being always colonial and empire building. And that's kind of a very hard and clear line for me. But at the same time, I was reading an essay by Judith Butler, and she wrote about how oftentimes within the US, narratives, if we go back to narratives again, about these violences, about acts of terror or 9/11 or these large-scale things, always end up being reported mostly through a personal lens and personal narrative lens. So you do a profile of like a person and what their lives, how this person's been since they were young, what suffering they went through that radicalized them into these acts. It's always very personal, like this personal lens through it. So we see it as a very individual emotions, like this person got hurt, they got bullied, or they got rejected, and then they joined whatever, and they got ideologized in this way. And in my own writing and poetry, you know, I write free verse, the I comes in and out of the poems, and that always makes me think of how the personal, it sounds cliche that the personal is political, but that's it. It distills down to that, is that instead of only focusing on each personal narrative, what does it mean if we look further, if we pull further back and try and investigate the webs of power that lead to these personal lives, or try and make those connections and try and relate them together. And I think that that's really valuable, I guess.
I wanted to clarify one thing. With your essay, like you write about Danny, and I was curious, like he's not in the system until he's arrested, am I right? Like, so a lot of these kids, they've been living in America for a long time, and then the only time there's any documentation about them is when they get arrested. And that's also, am I right, that that's also the moment when the government now decides in this political climate that they can be deported?
Yes, we've talked earlier about this notion of disappearance, you know, that happens on many levels. To give a quick history of the country where Danny is from, where my essay is about, talks about this person, a friend of mine. My parents are from Laos, a country in Southeast Asia that has been bombed by the Americans for like 9 years, between 1963 and 1974. And it's 9 years. And if you're going for trivia, 9 years, the rate of one plane load of bombs every 8 minutes for 9 years, 24 hours, 7, nonstop. This is the first disappearance, is that it is hardly mentioned in history books. The US has bombed a country for 9 years nonstop, and barely anyone ever, knows about it. So that's one disappearance, if we're going to talk about evidence. But so Danny and I are from, our parents and him are from Laos, and so there was a wave of refugees at the end of the 70s who established themselves in the US and Canada. And like I mentioned earlier, they came very young, they didn't have the papers. For whatever reason, our parents were not necessarily on top of paperwork for obvious reasons. And so we were able to kind of exist in this void, which is a kind of, again, disappearance. We come here and then you don't hear about us for a while. And then until something happens like that, where we go to prison, or we something happens in the news and suddenly we exist. But yes, until that moment, and there's a complicity with the people who write history in terms of erasure. You know, it's not just because we're under the radar. There is, you know, a decision at some point to not talk about this. And the war in Laos was called the secret war because the CIA was not supposed to be there in the first place. So there was, you know, it is not just something that was neglected. There was a willful decision to not mention it, and therefore accepting refugees, I mean, it becomes a footnote. We don't explain why we're here. We don't explain how long we're here. And that's, I would say, the second form of disappearance. The refugee experience can be a disappearance, you know.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just like be open to discussing with one another the past things that I've said. So I may sort of respond to some of the things that you guys have brought up, and one of those subjects is the idea of documentation, something that you know, has more than one meaning. There's the way in which this project is the documentation of a number of different experiences. But there's also the idea of like being documented or having documentation that essentially informs someone of your rights, something that for many Americans we just don't think about because our human rights are sort of assumed to be guaranteed just by being in the world and being recognizably American, right? So I just want to sort of hear. I don't know that I have a clear question, but I want to hear your all thoughts about that, because I think in each one of your pieces there's sort of a discussion surrounding feeling endangered because of one's appearance or identity, or feeling endangered because of a lack of rights being guaranteed by the state, essentially. So yeah, so if you could sort of talk about that, either from your piece or your personal experience.
Well, the privilege of having those rights taken for granted is the freedom of movement as well, right? It's to say that I can drive a car, I can move around between borders, and I can travel, I can do these things, and I don't have to think about it. That's that freedom. And in your case, in that example you mentioned, is that at the moment, though, that the refugees are documented, simultaneously they lose that freedom because you're documented for reasons to put you away, or you committed a transgression or whatever. So you're in a position where you're kind of getting close to getting that freedom, but you will never get it, and you're losing it at the same time. So I think that I see the grief there. And that's valid.
It's interesting that you bring up grief at the end as well. I'm thinking of something C.S. Lewis said, which is that grief is surprisingly akin to fear, that the experience of feeling grief is a lot like being afraid. And it reminds me of so much of, honestly, my day-to-day existence, this constant sort of shadow that you walk in, not knowing how the way that somebody is watching you will translate into what somebody will do. And there are many privileges that you might not even realize that you had before you transition and you walk in another pair of shoes. And all of a sudden, the world begins to shift. And I love the idea of proof casting a shadow because, you know, this implies something material. Proof is something that is there, something that, you know, makes a shadow that you can see. But that implies that something exists. And a lot of the rhetoric I've heard recently is about, for instance, how trans people should be erased from the legal system, which was a big story in the New York Times a few months ago. And it might seem trivial in some sense, what does that even mean to be legally erased? But that reflects the way that language shapes how we view the world. That if my language is not used, I stop existing in some form. I'm still here, but if language doesn't include someone like me, or someone like you, or someone like you, then in some way we cease to exist. And the only way that we can have a complete account of what it means to be American, much less what it means to be anything else, is to see these stories from a lot of different angles. Because there is no one definition of being anything. That can only come from a multiplicity of stories connecting. And that's how you make visibility. And I think we need that very strongly now. But when you say that, sometimes people tell you, oh, you're bothering too much. The things aren't that bad. What are you complaining about? And the fact that some people say that, I don't even think I have to explain why that is problematic. It's as if we live in two different Americas. There is mine, and there is the America that exists for somebody who does not understand somebody like me. There is the America that James Baldwin lived in, where he thought that the American flag did not mean for him what it meant for somebody who was white. That the flag he had pledged allegiance to had not pledged allegiance to him. And that's how I often feel on many levels. And I hope this project opens discussions about all of this. That's sort of what we're doing today, or at least attempting to.
Well, so sort of related to that, like speaking of Baldwin, because Baldwin actually appears both in Your Piece and in Grace's, and just thinking in general about artists. So I think there's like a few pervasive ideas about artists, but one of the really big ones is that artists are like intensely individual and sort of write about what moves them. And there's a way in which I think that's always kind of true. But Baldwin in particular was an artist who I think clearly had an idea about social responsibility. And ironically, for an artist that many Americans cherish and love and are proud to claim as an American, he felt forced to leave this country. And so I guess my question is what is the role, like what is social responsibility to the artist? Like do artists have that? Because I know that there are a number of artists, I've met many artists who may not say that the answer is no, but there are some artists who speak openly about that being a concept that they believe in and care about, and there are others who do not. So I'm kind of wondering, what is the role of the artist in terms of social responsibility?
Who wants to go first?
I can start. I think this side of the panel put it very well, that the personal is political and the political is personal. There is no way to separate art from politics. If it seems like there is, then you're not looking at it in a nuanced enough way. And I think the ability to even say that art might not be political is sort of redolent of some degree of privilege. And every human being has some kind of privilege at some level, usually. There's always a blind spot that we might have. But at the end of the day, art is always at some level political. It reminds me of this discussion we keep having about quote-unquote identity politics, which is a term that I despise because I think that all politics is connected to identity. And yet that term only means, people who are non-white and people who are queer, people who are, in other words, part of some sort of marginalized community. That's what identity politics seems to mean as a term. And I don't understand why that is, but I also completely understand why that is. So to answer your question and stop rambling, I think that artists do have a responsibility to be, you know, in the world. I don't think you necessarily have to write directly about politics, but I think you have to at least be aware of the power dynamics that you're writing about, if that makes sense.
I think, for me, it's impossible to separate. My existence is historical. You know, I was born in Montreal because my parents escaped the war. I exist within this historical context that I can't shed. You know, just we are not born in a vacuum. We're born, you know, in a certain setting, a certain time, and that makes me who I am. And I can't shed that. And even if I don't write specifically, I mean, I do, but even if I didn't write specifically to it, it is, I am a product of history, and I cannot speak of my time without addressing it. I was born in Montreal. My parents came from Laos, which is a former French colony. They were refugees in another French colony, which is the province of Quebec, formerly called from France. It has shaped who I am and what I have read, and to not address that, to not address how, you know, my thought was formed, it would seem like a huge blind spot to not address this. And I don't know if my art would be complete in a way if I didn't address all these factors. You know, when we're talking about privilege, I wish I didn't have to address it. It would be easy to more if I said I just want to write about, you know, cute bunnies being born. And
I think bunnies can be political.
But you know what? Bunnies are super political. But I don't know who gets to wake up in the morning and do art and not address it. I would like to ask them how they do it, but to me, I just can't. I don't know how to do it. It's part of how I came to be.
Even with the bunny, I mean, it's like, if I'm writing about bunnies, where am I a child of refugees, and then we went to adopt a bunny, and what's the story behind them having that bunny, or am I just, I don't know, galloping in the wild and encounter a bunny, and why am I in the wild, what am I doing there? And that's all part of the history of that piece of art. And I think that it's so, to think of creating art in a vacuum, like we're just a brain in space and then this divine things coming out of it, that's absurd, because even that brain, what is that brain consuming? What previous arts have that brain read? What other things is that artists are doing, and that leads to the output of that person. And I think especially making art out of a marginalized background, because was part of the question about risk or safety, and how maybe there's a degree of risk in writing about something that's invisible, something that's uncommon, something that maybe we perceive the general public as not being able to consume or understand or connect with it. So it's always a balance of feeling at risk, putting yourself out there, being hyper visible, but we're also doing it in order to get to a level of safety, right? To tell the stories, to set out, to expose yourself, your heart, your desire, your skin, your flesh, to say that I'm here, I exist like this. And then to invite people to see that difference and recognize and say that that's valid. But at the same time, I feel like on a personal level, as much as I'm saying these are my differences, I put it in my work, or I want people to see it, I also deeply want people to see that I'm also the same as you, in that we are all vulnerable, we need one another, we need that community, we need other people, we need love, we need all of that. I mean, that we are the same. So in highlighting the differences and highlighting marginalization and highlighting the very specific historical context of where the art comes from is a movement towards saying that we're not that different.
I think one of the interesting things about the idea that some writing is political and other writing is not is that the person who frames it that way, it feels like, is doing like an act of erasure of their own politics, right? So like, the thing that I always think about is how I've seen so many people talk about kneeling during the national anthem to protest police brutality. Like, why are they making this thing political? But it's during the national anthem. Like, what is more political than the national anthem? Like, they're not the one politicizing that event. And that, yeah, just often the thing that is being called apolitical is just an assumed political idea that is being challenged by work that's being called political, right? So part of, I guess my question surrounding that is, and sort of going back to this idea of risk, is that to say something political, like if it's the case that what we're calling political ends up being sort of something against a more dominant narrative, it ends up always being a kind of a risk, right? So my question is, like, what responsibility do we have to ourselves as artists to be safe? Because I think, depending what you're writing, you're putting yourself out there in a way.
My quick response is actually to question back the idea of safety. It means so many different things as an artist. Is it safe in the world? Like, I feel safe that people are gonna see me, they're not gonna attack me, or they're not gonna reject me. Safety in the world, or safety from criticism, safety from getting things wrong, or landing on a wrong spot and being held accountable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm gonna put you out there. I was reading Keith's essay, and we kind of had this debate about some points in there that was made. And then I think when we're writing difficult things, there's often this impulse, you express it, I share it too, to say that, well, it's better to not write about this at all, it's kind of too thorny, or it's too political, it's too difficult. And I think that it's important to write or work or create art through that, and understanding that, again, if we're looking at context or history, to say that we are not just this one thing we make, then we're a body of work. And especially coming from philosophy, that's where I did my bachelor's in. You read these people writing long tunes of their ideas and theories, and then they write a second book to disagree with the first one. And then they publish a third book and publish 10 letters from people disagreeing with that, and then they address that. So to kind of have this continuity, to say that even if I kind of got some things wrong and people are calling me out for it, the world, my community members, and so on, to come back and respond to that as well, and keep doing that, because otherwise it's just going to be silence.
I was going to make a point that there's also politics in what you leave out.
Yeah.
And the essay that I wrote for this project, like, I left a section out, and part of that had to do with the word count limit, which I surpassed. I surpassed it very shockingly that, but also it was also thinking about who I was going to hurt if I put that one line or two lines in. And there's the politics of that too, like wondering, who am I willing to hurt, who am I not willing to hurt, who am I willing to ask accountability of, who am I not willing to ask accountability of, and also the politics of, like, I know I questioned it, am I even allowed to write this essay? And I put that in the thing because I'm like, am I allowed to write about this? And Dante Cat says something really interesting. She says that she writes about everything that comes into her mind and anything like that she thinks is interesting or she thinks that she wants to have a conversation about, but then she puts it in a drawer. And she's like, I'm gonna think about this later whether or not I want to publish it. And I think that's amazing. But every time I finish writing a thing, I'm like, send. Because there's also that. Like, so there's the terror, and then I'm like, get it out of here. So I'm like done with this, you know. So.
I'm glad you mentioned Edwidge Danticat, because she's very relevant to this. This idea in her book of the same name, Create Dangerously. This idea of how it is important as an artist to write something, and I'm butchering her words as I do, that it's important to write something that somebody someday might risk their lives to read. And this might seem like something that you think at the time is safe, but somebody reads it in a place where they feel oppressed, and they see that thing that you wrote, and they think, oh my God, this is what I needed. So many of us in this audience have probably had this experience at some level. You read something and you see yourself in it, and you're like, holy shit, this is me. Somebody like me exists. And that's very important. I do question the notion of safety in the question because, I legally changed my name from something else. Every time I publish something, it's under my current name. I don't really feel like I have the same degree of safety that you might have, Keith, because every time I publish something, just by virtue of my name being there, regardless of the subject matter, I'm, for better or for worse, forced to put myself out there as a person who is no longer the person I used to be under a certain name. In other words, every time I write something, I have to put my name there, and that means I'm irrevocably trans. And that fact is why I don't live in the country I grew up, because I couldn't be myself there. So for some of us, safety is not even possible unless you take your name out.
Risk to me of writing was something that we discussed a lot in my home. My parents led a communist regime. So this was something that was always, kind of in the air of what you say and what you don't say. It is almost a self-censorship that results from fleeing that kind of country. And you don't realize it follows you for a while. And it tells you a lot of, like you said, Michelle, about what you leave out of your narrative. And sometimes you don't even know the risk that you're trying to sidestep because you're so used to self-censoring that you just never even think of it. And in my personal life as the daughter of a refugee, when you tell the story of your parents or your community, you develop almost this sensor of this sixth sense of what people want to hear about the story. Like the trauma, the survival, the overcoming, and you almost tailor it, because you want to be documented as that's a story. It's you trying to dodge the risk of being seen as a bad refugee or a bad immigrant.
You want to be one of the good ones.
You want to be a deserving one, and you don't even have to talk about refugee poverty. The deserving poor. Like, who deserves to be helped? Like, how good do you have to be as a poor person? I'd say that as someone who grew up in poverty, to deserve help. What is your story supposed to be to deserve help? Again, going back to Danny, I never tell people what Danny has done to be in prison. It is, first of all, not my story to tell. But just think of someone who came out of prison, and how much would you be willing to accept in terms of, of what's acceptable for him to get help? Where is that line for you? When you meet someone, how many mistakes do you allow someone to make before you help them? And that, that's another form of personal risk that you take. Do you trust this person? Do you not trust this person? And then, I think that's one of the risks that we take that's not always tangible, but we make that judgment every time we meet someone new. You know, it's like, how much will I forgive this person? And then when you apply that to policies, you know, with it, that becomes like a really big question in terms of risk and in terms of the story you choose to tell, right?
Misha, how much time?
I think we're almost out, so we should like have Grace read.
Yeah, so Grace's work is the only work on this panel that's currently up. And also she has a new book out, so we'd love to have her read a poem from Korean.
Just a poem.
A poem.
We had like
Read the
maybe
whole
time
book.
for like 2 poems, and then we have to open up to questions.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, I'm like the time.
Depends on, I was not keeping track of time, I'm sorry.
It's a book length poem. The use of lyricism. This morning, the dim skies are halting the passage of time, an error in the weather. I am in 2 places, torn between the clouds, outside, and some photos on my screen. James Baldwin, former house in the south of France. The first thing the developers tore down was his writing studio to make way for luxury villas they will name the Garden of Arts, bidding up to $30 million. Only the garden will not be Baldwin's garden, will not have the round table at which he took reading breaks. 3 years before his death, he admitted, I certainly have not told my story yet. This mimetic silence drums with hope, waiting to sound out in the many more decades he thought were to come. It's hard for me to recognize me, he said. The way the world treats you is unbearable. The Garden of Arts will carry luminous myths of Baldwin the artist, stripped of any locatable color or weight. Popular psychology keeps pumping up optimism via anecdotal studies, see how art can save lives even if it kills its maker. Baldwin once wrote of someone questioning Miles Davis, giving money to Billie Holiday. Why did he do it knowing she'd just spend it all on heroin? Baby, Davis only said, have you ever been sick? And that answer stretched into the most buoyant footpath I'd ever set my feet on, never mind where it led or came from. I don't think it's as simple as temptation that pulls us out every time the street ahead turns a dark corner. You could master your destiny every waking hour, and the bell curve will still get you at night. And that's how Thatcher was dead wrong to say there is no such thing as society, and people must look after themselves first. This biological essentialist argument for selfishness flew out the window the moment the first human carved a piece of dead wood into the likeness of the animal she was supposed to hunt, and who did it neither to attract a mate or to generate food. This task of creating representations of reality drove a stake into the ground that day, and have since doubled as a pilgrimage site for theorists who make grand claims about utility or victory or hardwired instincts, as in every time I walk my dog toward the Mississippi levee, I have to pass a shiny plaque that reads, "Freedom isn't free." Who knew violence struggled to believe in its own surety and looked for comfort too? The theater of imperialism is always weeping over its self-inflicted wound, while I stroll away my days trying to become everyone's best American girl. Even the most compelling means of escape winds up being just a metaphor. Because after the house is dismantled and the invasive weeds rooted out, were you supposed to transcend language and never worry about falling in love with your aggressor? Sometimes on these long walks, I try to walk with light steps for fear of putting too much pressure on this earth. Because what would I do with anything more? Holiday had 70 cents to her name at her deathbed, her liver rock hard and bleeding out at 44, a fact unconcerned but completely entwined with what the world had done to her. Without greatness, she'd written, "Don't explain, right or wrong don't matter." And I imagine her voice, rising up round and fat and pomegranate sweet, billowing toward the clouds up where I cannot see. And today's heaviness is already thinning out, ready to fall again as rain. Thank you.
Before we take questions from the crowd, I can look out and see some of the editors from Kenyon Review, and I just wanted to thank them on Keith and my behalf because they helped us with the project like
A lot.
a lot. We just did the easy stuff, asking people to submit and writing our own essays, but the editors, I mean, I don't know how you guys do it. If anyone has questions.
Yeah, we can open it up for questions.
In regards to the issue of telling stories that have been erased or disappeared, how do you manage the fear of the burden of representation and the fear of trying to tell a story that has nothing to ground it and encompass a whole story? How do you ensure that you feel that the story is honest and true?
The
Such a great
struggle.
question. It's such a great question.
Yeah.
That's Kenyon students.
Who wants to start?
I mean, it's a little tautological. I think you sort of said it, right? I mean, first you have to be honest. And not just honest, but unsparing. You have to, I think on a craft level, if you want to tell a story of representation that rings true, you have to be very specific and concrete in your details because every detail matters. And this includes the details that you might think don't matter. What it's like to do something mundane. And for somebody in other shoes, that mundane thing might be momentous. And capturing that feeling is partly how you make it real. You also have to consider whose story you're telling, the power dynamics and, speaking for somebody else. I do believe that writers and artists shouldn't necessarily have restrictions in a general sense, that at least in theory, anybody can write anything. But in terms of practice, it's a little more complicated because, the subject matter that you choose to write, I think you have to make sure that there's a reason and that there is a good reason that you are choosing to write about this. And that the person's story that you're telling is a story that you, if you were in a court, that you could defend. If you knew that your life was on the line, not theirs, but yours, would you still stand by what you wrote? And that might sound extremely extreme, but I think that's a standard that helps you get to the right sort of stuff. Very inarticulate ending, but yes.
I want to bring up the risk that comes with representation of tokenism. I come from a very small community. There's not a lot of writers from my community. And often when a few of us, get there and we get published or we get seen, we'll say, oh, you represent your community. And the danger with, it sounds good on the surface, but the danger with that is that it erases the people who came before you. There is always someone that came before you. And when somebody congratulates you, for representing your community, always remember that you built this, even if it was something that is not directly linked to what you did, someone allowed you to be able to say it or to write it. And I think in the United States, we really have to acknowledge the work that the African American community has done in terms of activism. Asian communities are, learning from them right now. We're talking about it. And also representation, tokenism, we inherit the language of this system. You know, the word representation implies as this symbolism. You know, you are a small group of people who became the emblem for this larger group of people. So I think we kind of have to blow up the idea of representation a little bit and make it more multifaceted. And I think when you think you've expressed the views or the description of a queen, if you think you've nailed it, go back to it again, because you probably didn't. Is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. But I really, really want to say, like, we don't start from scratch. None of us do. It might not be directly from your community sometimes, but usually it is. Go look for it, you know, and often their work will have been erased too. So part of us is to be some kind of archaeologist, to go back and to say what work has been done before you, and to acknowledge that work and bring it to light. I think that's also part of the work we have to do to
find your people,
Find
in
your
a way.
people,
Like,
yeah.
even if it's not a local community and you're totally alone in this small town and you have a story to tell that you've never heard before, or you haven't seen anyone who's done it before. Reddit, MySpace, LiveJournal, Twitter, they're kind of there, right? You link yourself to them, but also recognize that it is really, really, really freaking hard. And people are going to put the burden on you if you come out and tell the story, and you're going to have blind spots, or you're not doing it well enough, or you're not fully representing all this multifaceted people, and you're like, I'm just one voice. But it gets stronger. You build up with other voices and keep doing that, and don't not do it.
Yeah, I think also willing to accept the fact that you're not going to get everything. Like, you can't possibly get everything, and you can't possibly represent everything, and being willing to be like, I'm going to put this piece of art out there, and there will be criticism and people will disagree, because there's not one particular way to be a thing. Like, you know, I mean, Arundhati Roy's India is very different from Kiran Desai's India. And these two are both writers that I admire a great deal, and they can't not write about politics when they write, but they also are just trying to tell beautiful stories. And while they're telling those stories, they look at a historical sweep, a political sweep of things. And I think about, like, we had a podcast before, and all of us were talking, we were also talking about inherited memories. Like, for example, I was born in free India, but I have all the stories about my grandfathers being freedom fighters. And so when I meet British people, I can't resist it. Like, it just is I'll be talking to them perfectly nicely, but then I'll, like, sting them with something. Like, I'll say something about, like, how they still think they own the world, but haha, like, India got them back because they all eat curry on Friday night, you know? Like, so, and having lived in Britain, I can see it. The takeout food, the go-to food is like curry quite often. So it's, like, great to be able to, but why does it bother me so much? Like, it's an inherited memory. And I remember my dad also, like, the idea of excavation, my father telling me that his grandfather ran away because they tried to marry him too many times. Like, he got married the first time, his wife died, so they married him a second time, and then she died, and he's like, fuck this, and he went to Burma. Okay, so I remember, like, trying to find him, and I had, like, a fellowship, and I had a little scholarship, like, Gabby and I had traveled together to Britain, and we, like, were doing research, and I found my grandfather in an archive. And the thing about the British is, like, they're called, like, a nation of shopkeepers, but they're so good at documenting everything. Like, who they killed and how they murdered, that is also documented. And so it was amazing to be able to find my grandfather mentioned as this great-grandfather mentioned as a businessman. It was just like a line. But what one judge was telling another judge, like, in that letter, I found enough, and I wrote to my father, I was like, is it the same guy? Like, and my dad's like, yeah, that's him, he ran off. Like, he left his children, he's like, no more marriages for him. But I thought that was amazing, you know, like, just to be able to find that. And so sometimes writing from nothing is like, it's a memory, it's a whisper, hearing my great aunt gossip about something that I can't find, but I can make something of it, you know, like, I can try. That's part of, like, fiction helps with that, I think. But also literary nonfiction is so much about imagining what doesn't exist. It's your job to take as many facts as you can and then imagine it, so that, you know, when you read it, it hits you hard, you sort of bleed.
I want to add on a very, very personal level, like, make sure you have friends with who you can get your ideas wrong. You know, there's so much pressure. There's so much pressure right now up there on being quippy and witty and quick. And you all know those friends on Twitter who are like amazing at it. Especially as
Keith
like
Wilson.
Chen. I can't survive in this world. It takes me like a week to formulate one thought. But I mean, take that pressure off and have the kind of like have a few friends with who you allow yourself to be wrong. You can't write something that takes risk if you don't allow yourself to just even spitball it with those friends. And I think, you know, we talk about risk, we talk about representation. At some point, in all these ancient philosophers and writers, you know, they got it wrong. Like Wittgenstein wrote a whole thing and like. It was sentenced and he went back like, that was all crap.
Well, Kierkegaard had 13 names, and then he was published wildly on the different names. And he argued with each other. So he was the original. He would be like someone with 13 Twitter accounts.
You know, you write fan fiction before you publish a novel.
I'm curious if anyone had more questions too.
Yeah.
Actually, you know, we are like completely out of it. So thank you for that question, Isaac.
No, that's a good question.
I take credit for him because he was my student last year. So I'm totally taking credit for how intelligent he is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say one final thing. I guess since you mentioned Kierkegaard, you know, he talked about this idea of making a leap of faith at some point, right? And I think that's important when it comes to representation. Just a sort of final note that you're never going to be able to represent everybody, which is what everyone has been saying, right? You know, I am myself, you're yourself, we're all part of some community, but that community is always bigger than we are. And I think it's important to understand that you're always capturing a person or persons, but you're not capturing a community. You're capturing a piece of it. And if you can accept that, then you can go from there. But if your goal is to capture every trans person, every Black American, every Korean person, every whatever group it might be, there is no way to do that. We are often tasked, you know, the writer of a particular group is often the person who is expected to do that, but you can't. And once you can accept that, you know, it makes it a little easier. And sorry, I didn't mean to go over the time. Just I think that's important to keep in mind.
Grace's books are here for you.
Yeah, please check out the books.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.